Hello and happy Canada Day. I'm Jesse McGowan and thank you so much for tuning into CKPG's Celebrating Canada as we look at things uniquely Canadian. Now, there certainly are many symbols of this great nation. We'll take a look at the maple leaf in a moment, but first, how about the Canada goose? Recently, a beautiful relationship took flight between a small feathered family and a local woman who became their host.
This spring saw the beginning of a beautiful, truly Canadian love story.
I started last Wednesday, so about a week ago. But sooner than that, it was just the pair, which was very cool.
Yeah, so were you a little shocked? Did you kind of go do a double take when you saw?
No, we see a lot of wildlife here, but it was just a pleasure to see them. They stayed here for several days, and then we saw the 3 goslings. It was just a thrill. That's the beginning of the story.
But certainly not the end of the story by far. It's a tale of a love Robin Lapp and her husband Richard developed for a gaggle of geese and their brood down along the banks of the Nechako River.
When they first came, see that little clutch of bush there? You can see just past that several feet, it's like a little stick sticking out of the water. That's where the end of the little lawn is. So they were just up there swimming on the river, and they would come up and rest and eat in this little area. And this is how quickly that's come up. But when the little goslings were here, it has dips in it, so there would be a lot of grass and just little ponds for them to swim in and explore the bottom of the pond. It was so cool.
Robin would sit on the bench at the river's edge, not moving a muscle, to watch this little family emerge.
And the mom would be having a little breakfast, and the dad's neck was stretched out. I don't know how he could have done that, and he didn't take his eye off me. So he was being a good dad.
Boaters and ultimately a dog sent this crew packing, very concerning for Robin.
They were frightened by that. And they disappeared, and I was worried for the little ones, thinking that they might perish in the fast river, but they were right back there the next day, and then there was 15 of them.
But the family grew again after another scare that sent them away from the site once again.
They just took off and swept away, and then they were gone until the next early morning. But it was just the parents, and they came back, and they were crying and calling. They were so mournful, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe an hour later, because they were crying for about 3 hours. So just before the end of that 3 hours, a pair came in, and I know that this pair had come to comfort them. And then shortly after that, there was another pair. So there were 6 adults, and I'd never seen only the 2 original parents. So they came to give them support, I believe.
Canada geese typically return to their nesting grounds, and Robin says to have them back each year would be a marvel.
Oh, I'd love for them to come back. They're just beautiful. I have never felt such peace for years and years as I sat here and watched them interact together.
And to be able to play host to a truly Canadian icon one more time or more would be an honor. Cheryl Jan, CKPG News.
Another prominent symbol of Canada is, of course, the maple leaf. It's been 55 years since our official flag was unveiled, but for centuries before, the maple tree served as an important resource in Canada's landscape. Whether it be for its sweet syrup or its contribution to Canadian forestry, the maple tree has always been a prominent figure in our country. Whether it be on top of your favorite breakfast, on the jersey of one of Canada's oldest hockey teams, or smack dab in the middle of our national flag, it's no secret that maple trees in all its forms are an integral part of Canada's nationalism.
The fabric of Canada is a fabric of many species of maple.
Oog Massacott has been studying forestry for his entire life, spending the last 26 years lending his experience to UNBC's forestry program. The native of Quebec City certainly knows a thing or two about Canada's connection to maple trees, as Eastern Canada is where our national tree has the deepest roots.
From Nova Scotia to just at the border of Manitoba and Ontario is where the big flank of maple sugar maple tree is. It goes in the United States, of course, but this is where, you know, the forests of maple exist. After that, as you go westernly toward us, you find some species of maple, but never to the extent that will make it so important in the eastern Canadian landscape.
As it turns out, that area is perfect for the trees that survive best in the temperate zone of the Northern Hemisphere. While there are approximately 150 species of maple around the world, there are 10 Canadian species of maple, including the famously sweet sugar maple, which is believed to have first been tapped for its precious little resource in the 6th or 7th century by the indigenous communities living in northeastern North America.
It's quite clear that the early Europeans were shown by First Nation, I think Iroquois, and probably other indigenous group knew how to tap the trees. They would collect the sap, of course, labor of love that probably First Nation were doing in the early spring. Imagine that. You've had a hard winter, you've been confined, and so all of a sudden you have the possibility of getting a syrup that is so sweet. You could cook meat with that. You could probably make some if you pour that sap onto the snow, you can make great candies out of that. So it would be a super treat.
The trees warrant something that's sought after around the globe, while the leaves are used to solely represent our home and native land. When the country's current flag was chosen in 1965, the leaf was meant to represent the cultural heritage of the nation and the natural resources of Canada. But the symbolism of the trees can run much further in what it means to be Canadian.
You could certainly say that Canadians are sweet in general, but also we are resilient. These trees can certainly last several hundred years. They occupy a landscape that is very important in Canada. They are diverse. There are diversity of maples.
As for maple trees native to British Columbia, you'll see 3, including the Douglas maple, which is the most prominent in northern BC. All these trees serving as a symbol of the resilient, sweet, and diverse nature of our nation. Jesse McGowan, CKPG News. From trailblazing astronomers to revolutionary inventions and new discoveries, Canada has been as strong as anywhere when it comes to exploring the final frontier of outer space. And some of those contributions come even closer to home than you may think.
When you first think of advancements in astronomy, Canada might not be one of the first places many people think of in terms of superpowers. But it just so happens, from shore to shore and even here in Prince George, Canada has played quite the role in many aspects of astronomy. The first person to put her stamp on space was Helen Sawyer Hogg, an American-born Canadian astronomer who helped pioneer research into globular clusters or star clusters, as well as inspiring future generations of women to get into science.
For 30 years, she was the voice of astronomy, always doing radio programs daily on the radios, TV stations in Toronto, a real diehard, a real push. And every year, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada honors her with our guest lecture for the General Assembly. So the person that we pay the money for to bring in the big speaker, it is the Helen Sawyer Lecture.
Moving forward, we get to one of the most notable Canadian contributions, that being the Canadarm. First sent into orbit in 1981, the Canadarm, and now Canadarm2, is known for deploying, capturing, and repairing satellites, positioning astronauts, maintaining equipment, and moving cargo. This invention really started pushing the envelope in terms of what could be done.
Now you have a robotic manipulator where somebody can sit inside and you can move large packages around and position them. So yes, I mean that Canadarm also then moved to the space shuttle. So we're familiar with all the shuttles and all the satellite orbit insertions and taking work up, modules up to the Hubble for repairs and upgrades. So yes, so that Canadarm continued in future aspects and on the current International Space Station.
More recently, and closer to home, discoveries can always be made even on a whim. In Prince George, the PG Astronomical Society is ever growing, just like our knowledge of space. And just a couple of years ago, Malhar Kandekar, an Indian-born man who now calls Prince George home, found 3 supernovas in just 2 days.
I was a bit worried that why I haven't got the confirmation, and then just email popped up on my phone that congratulations, you got a confirmation of your first discovery. I just screamed like, holy, I discovered a supernova. That was the really exciting, one of the best feelings I have had in my life.
And with that same opportunity, you never know what could be next.
I think now, because of communications with the internet, anybody, anyplace can make a contribution. You don't have to rely on, say, publishing through university or through a book.
Because the sky in this case is not the limit. It's only the beginning. Matt Fatinko, CKPG News.
Coming up next on Celebrating Canada, our involvement in the Second World War shaped many cities in Canada, including Prince George. We'll take a look at how the international involvement altered Canada's north after the break. World War II is a piece of history that will forever impact people's lives, but it also changed the future of cities and towns right across the globe. In Canada, Prince George is just one example of a city put on the map and destined for growth after the war.
Prince George. It was a small town at the beginning and the end of the First World War, and the Great Depression that followed didn't serve any kindness to the small northern BC town. But Prince George's fate was about to change.
When World War II came around, everything really changed. And World War II probably was one of the most significant changes for Prince George. It was largely due to 2 main reasons.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
First, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Canadian forces thought it best to protect the West Coast, strategically sending troops to Prince George in case of a coastal invasion. And second, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan aimed at training over 300,000 aircrew members in Canada for the war. That caused the beginning of Prince George's prosperous forestry industry.
That meant they needed wood, and they needed wood from Prince George, BC. So sawmills started springing up everywhere, and wood was going out of here gangbusters. So you see a lot of building of work camps, you see sawmill camps. The trains benefited from this, and it became a prosperous time for Prince George.
The population grew immensely, with around 3,000 people habituated in the town pre-World War II and over 12,000 military personnel arriving almost overnight. And that's how Prince George began its journey in becoming a military town.
This is really the center of what was at the time the military training site. The headquarters in Prince George was on Hammond Avenue, and there were training facilities everywhere west of the bypass, basically, including mortar ranges, quick attack areas.
Prince George was inundated with military personnel who didn't waste any time in getting comfortable, taking over the local theater, restaurants, and bars, and creating a spike in local business.
Business was booming, but this is a strange part of the local economic scene. Businesses weren't exactly allowed to make much of a profit. They were allowed to make up until a certain amount, and then everything else after that went to the war effort.
So what exactly did the Second World War do for our city of now more than 75,000 people?
Prince George got a major airport. It became a major transportation hub. It developed a major industry, and it started well on the way to being a successful community center for the northern interior of British Columbia.
Evidence of the Second World War remain across the city, with warehouses still standing near the railway and, of course, the once prosperous forestry industry, which brought jobs and fortified the city's economy. Veronica Beltran, CKPG News.
Beehive burners were once commonplace at lumber mills right across Canada. The standalone steel structures were used to burn wood and sawdust waste until environmental concerns led to their demise. Some of these burners are still left standing, though, in small Canadian cities that helped build our economy.
Throughout the province of British Columbia during the mid-20th century, thousands of beehive burners could be seen poking up along the landscape. These steel structures were designed to burn large amounts of sawdust, bark, and other waste wood that accumulated from the saw and planer mills.
Before we had beehive burners, people would leave all their, at planers and sawmills, people would leave their waste wood just in big piles or in open pits, and then they would burn them. Obviously, that's a giant hazard because it would create a lot of smoke and pollution, and this was seen as the answer to a huge problem. This was basically where there is that hole there was a conveyor belt that would feed into there, and that's where all the waste wood would go in there. And then the whole thing would be just big fire inside, and it would burn all the waste wood in a safe way where people weren't, forest fires weren't starting and people weren't getting hurt.
This 40-foot beehive burner stands on display at the Central BC Railway and Forestry Museum. It was designed like many of the beehive burners that stood in small communities across the province. The large freestanding steel structure would be cylindrical with an opening at the top that would have a mesh to keep the sparks and embers from escaping. This beehive burner was different than the older burners. It was equipped with the most up-to-date technology.
So what the beehive burner we have behind us is really the second generation of beehive burners. This was considered a more environmentally friendly beehive burner because it has a damper at the top, which helped control the amount of heat and how efficient it burned. But after that point, they still didn't like how much pollution it created, and in the 1990s, 1997, there was an Environmental Management Act that was passed, and basically you cannot have beehive burners anymore, and you have to have a special certificate allowance from the British Columbian government to burn them today.
According to Deidre Pratt, when the beehives burned, throughout the night, people could see it glow.
Sometimes when they get a little active, they can have like sparks coming out the top and fire, but that would be not the normal case. Typically they glowed, and from here we'd be able to feel the heat. Were immensely warm.
At the time when the beehive burners lit up the Canadian landscape, it was the popular method for getting rid of waste wood. While working, they created a lot of air pollution, and so the province began to phase them out in the late 1990s.
These transformed landscapes all over Canada, for better and for worse. They were huge polluters, and they have left visible scars or beautiful structures, depending on how you see them, everywhere.
Dave Branco, CKPG News.
Time now for our second break, and when we come back, we'll get to the sports scene where many local athletes have worn the red and white for our country. What's it like to don the maple leaf? You'll find out after the break. Representing your country on an international level is considered to be one of the highest honors in sports. And for many young athletes, it's something they spend their lives dreaming about. Prince George has seen several athletes pass through our city that have had that great honor.
Growing up in Canada, Canadian kids grow up thinking about one day wearing the Canadian flag, competing and representing their country in sport. However, only a small percentage have been able to, making it that much more of an honor.
I remember when I was a young kid watching the World Juniors with my dad and just kind of thinking, I'm going to be there one day. And, you always have those dreams.
I remember kind of our first preseason game, just kind of seeing Poisson on the back of a Canadian jersey. It was just something so special to me. And obviously it meant so much for kind of my family.
While both Gauthier and Poisson have represented Canada in the country's national sport of hockey, a pair of young athletes in Prince George will be donning the red and white in roller derby. Their competition was supposed to take place this year, but due to COVID-19 was pushed back until 2021. But despite the delay, the two are thrilled for the opportunity.
And it's not just we woke up one day and we're like, oh, I'm going to represent Canada. We've worked for, I'm pretty sure both of us, for around almost 8 years to get to the point where we feel like we're prepared enough and feel like we're good enough to represent our country. So I think it's just, I feel pride being able to do that.
It's really great to be able to represent your country, especially just with so many different people, and especially to be able to set kind of like an example, because like, you know, our hard work definitely paid off because we made the team. So it just like shows that, like, you know, if you put your mind to it, you can do whatever you want.
While Robinson and King Smith have to wait until 2021 to suit up for Canada on home soil in Regina, Poisson and Gauthier have experienced the thrill of not only playing for Canada, but doing it in front of the home crowd.
That's, to this day, is probably the highlight of my career. You know, being in Rogers Arena, playing in front of, I think it was like 11 or 12,000 people in the gold medal game. And then when that, you know, you can kind of hear the fans start to get up whenever there's a minute left in the game, and you're starting to count down, you're kind of watching the clock. And then whenever it finally hit 0, it was just pure joy.
It was awesome. Like, just kind of, I remember the Canada West versus Canada East game, and it was just the building's packed. Everyone, it's Canada against Canada. It's kind of what they come to see. So that was awesome, and it's something different, kind of hearing the national anthems kind of pre-game.
Gauthier won a gold medal at the Ivan Halinka tournament, while Poisson's Team Canada West came in 5th at the World Junior A Challenge. But despite the different results, both know it was an experience of a lifetime. And for Robinson and King Smith, they plan on soaking it all in when they wear the red and white in 2021. Jeremy Corrigan, CKPG News.
Is there anything more Canadian than cracking a cold one this Canada Day? Coming up next on Celebrating Canada, we'll take a look at the beer can, which our country and even our region has played a major role in developing. We Canadians sure love our hops and barley, and each time you crack open a cold can of beer, you're not only holding a piece of Canadiana in your hand, but also a bit of local history. What exactly is Northern BC's connection to the beer can? Take a look.
We Canadians sure like our beer, but there's also a local connection when it comes to cracking open a can of beer, and that's the can itself.
We can really thank one Mr. Ben Ginter for that, for introducing the beer can to, it's debatable whether it was all of Canada or just Western Canada that he introduced it to.
You either loved him or hated him, and the other breweries in Canada scoffed at Ginter.
They said, no one wants to drink beer out of a can. What, are you crazy?
And maybe he was, but he proved them all wrong. In 1962, Ginter opened Tartan Brewing, quickly beginning to innovate the BC brewing industry.
He introduced in 1966 this classic right here, the pill can.
For former longtime plant manager at what is now recognized as Pacific Western Brewing, Tom LeBeau lived through almost the entire history and evolution of the beer can, having started at Tartan Brewing back in 1969.
Yeah, I mean, he had his battles with the liquor board and the other breweries when they come in with cans, but, you know, over pricing and stuff. But he was the first, and Carling, at that time, Carling O'Keefe took him to court because of his name of Tartan Pilsner, or he called it a pill can.
According to LeBeau, the brewery in Prince George used steel cans up until 1983, when they installed equipment to have an aluminum can line. But what was the benefit of making such a change?
Aluminum is much lighter and much cheaper, and doesn't rust over time.
Beer drinkers in Prince George, whether it's a classic can of genuine Caribou or a can of Crossroads or Trench, canned beer is the way to go when it comes to beer, it seems, in our region, a true evolution when it was first introduced.
People had been trying to can beer since the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they didn't manage to do that until the 1930s. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that the pressure needed to produce beer was just too much for the typical canning.
Something that's since been achievable thanks to the help from some CO2.
The filler puts the beer in a can, and we have CO2 going across the top of it to make sure there's no air inclusion. Okay, lid is put on, and it's a double seam lid, and it gets folded over twice, and the tolerances are like a thousandth of an inch.
With your typical glass bottle of beer, it gets light struck, whereas a can of beer is able to keep all light out, which allows the beer to stay fresher longer. So whether Ben Ginter was indeed the first to bring canned beer to Canada or just BC, it's no question that he was onto something when it comes to getting that hops and barley right under the tab. Ethan Reddy, CKPG News.
So crack a cold drink, throw on your Team Canada jersey, and pour some maple syrup on your meal today as we celebrate another year living in this great country. Thank you so much for celebrating Canada with us today. Here's to many more, eh?